What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Recording here on Friday morning, February 10th. My name is Tyler Plath. I'm flying solo again. That's just the way things work nowadays, I guess. I just have to fly solo on the second episode of the week. Cameron and Lucas were on our episode earlier this week, recapping the top 20 wide receivers. They are my co-hosts, the three of us, the Fantasy Football Fellas. You can follow the Fantasy Football Fellas over on Twitter at FFFellas. You can follow us on Instagram at the FFFellas. Fantasy Football Fellas on TikTok, YouTube, where you should be subscribed. One, if you're not. You should also give this video a like, because there's a whole algorithm thing. Just help your boys out. Just help us out. That's all I'm asking. That's all I'm asking. Last little plug that you can find us. You can find us over on Chalkboard. Chalkboard is an exclusive group page that we have. It's really a group chat, I should say, with a whole bunch of different chats going on. There are almost 1,700 of us strong over there, where we talk waiver wires during the season starts and sits. We give you weekly rankings in terms of how we think certain players will do. We give player prop advice, and we actually show you which player props we find intriguing. All that and so much more, including what will likely be NFL draft / dynasty content. You can find all that over on our Chalkboard page, and the link to that will be in the description of this video or audio episode that you are listening / watching. Again, just want to say thank you for listening, viewing, watching, all of those things. Just thank you. Thank you for tuning into the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. We got a big year ahead of us. We're hoping to really grow the page in terms of guests that we can bring on, the content that we provide to you. No more low budget stuff. I mean, I've literally got a blanket covering my blinds because it's so sunny. So again, big year ahead of the Fantasy Football Fellas. Make sure that you are connected and come along with us for the ride. We'd love to have you join us. So, all right. This episode, we're covering the top 10 tight ends of the 2022-2023 fantasy football season. We're going to keep this one short and sweet because I think a lot of people would say that tight ends are not the position that you want to talk about a whole lot, but I really think it's more so just that it's a very boring conversation. I will try to make it as entertaining as possible and give you some thoughts and considerations that I have about how this year played out from the tight end position, where we had a lot of surprises. Like here's a little spoiler. Taysom Hill was a top 10 tight end this year. No one was saying that was going to be a thing. So again, this is a very different list in comparison to years past. So it'll be worth the watch, worth the listen to how it all played out this year. So before we get into that list, though, let's go through some news and notes. I know it's Super Bowl week, not many news and notes, but we had the NFL honors ceremony just the other day. So we'll go through that. And really any other Super Bowl news, if I'm forgetting any, I don't think so. But with that, let's transition into news and notes. All right. No big Super Bowl news to be aware of going into the game on Sunday, other than Kadarius Toney is running around like crazy at practice, which take that what you will. But at this point, if you're banged up, you are going to do whatever you can to play in that game. So do not be surprised if the injury reports are minimal for the game on Sunday. I mentioned the NFL honors. awards ceremony was just the other day. Let's recap the winners here real quick. Let's start with comeback player of the year. Actually, no, I want to save that one for last. Because I have a bone to pick with that one. Let's start with the Walton Payton. Walton Payton Man of the Year award winner. Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott. There's nothing that I can say about this award because I have no idea what goes into the Man of the Year award besides community work and all that kind of stuff. So great, awesome, good for Dak. On to the next award, Coach of the Year. Between guys like Kyle Shanahan, who had to deal with 3 or 4 different quarterbacks this whole year, Nick Sirianni, coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, also the team that had won the most games this year, arguably coached the best team this year. I know I'm forgetting a couple others, but regardless, winner of the Coach of the Year is actually the Giants head coach, Brian Daboll. And this one I can't disagree with either. You look at where the Giants were last year, or I guess now 2 seasons ago, and they were nowhere close to being in the playoffs. They were nowhere near close. And Daboll turned them into a playoff team. Now it's to be debated, strength of schedule, all that kind of stuff. And you kind of, hindsight's 2020, but you look at the opponents that the Giants played and, they won the games that they needed to win. And getting a playoff win, I think is what, put the cherry on top for Daboll to win this award. To go into Minnesota with the game plan that they did and really exposed the Vikings' weak spots and upset the Vikings. I think that was really what sealed the deal for Daboll to be Coach of the Year. And again, I can't say I disagree. You look at what the Giants were 2 seasons ago and what they just did this past season. I can't disagree with it. Defensive Player of the Year. This one was really between Micah Parsons and Nick Bosa, and the latter, and Nick Bosa took home the award, and it was either way. For me, at least, it was between the two. You couldn't get this one wrong, because if it was Parsons, cool. If it was Bosa, cool. I had no gripes about either of those guys winning it. Offensive Player of the Year. Vikings wide receiver Justin Jefferson. This one was, I want to say, pretty straightforward. You had other skill players, right? You had I'm just kind of naming players off the top of my head that also could have been deserving of this award. Tyreek Hill, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, Josh Jacobs, even to a certain extent. But Jefferson was by and far the right player to win the award. Let's go through Rookie of the Year award winners. Both come from the New York Jets. Defensive Rookie of the Year, none other than Sauce Gardner, who is legitimately already a top 5 corner, and he is going to be a problem for a lot of receivers moving forward. Offensive Rookie of the Year, wide receiver Garrett Wilson. And I know a lot of people would argue Kenneth Walker, and I think a lot of voters did too, because apparently Kenneth Walker had more first place votes than Garrett Wilson. But because of how the voting structure works, there are second place votes and third place votes. Garrett Wilson got more than second and third place votes than Kenneth Walker, which then gave Garrett Wilson the award. Kenneth Walker, very deserving as well. But when you look at Garrett Wilson and what he had to go through this year, right, with 3 different quarterbacks, you had Joe Flacco beginning of the year, then you moved into this limbo of Zach Wilson, and then you got Mike White, and all the injuries and all the drama that they dealt with at the quarterback position, and to see the season that Garrett Wilson had, who just missed the top 20 wide receivers in fantasy, Not saying that fantasy means everything for football, but just just for context, Garrett Wilson is the right choice in my opinion, and can't wait to see what he's going to be moving forward because I have him in one of my dynasty leagues, and I'm pumped. And I'm really, really hoping the Jets go out and get a veteran quarterback like Aaron Rodgers. Like Aaron Rodgers, please. I'm just excited to see whoever the new Jets quarterback is because I feel like no matter who it is, Garrett Wilson will improve next year because of that. Your 2022-2023 MVP was between Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes took home the most valuable player award, and I can't say I disagree with it. I think had Jalen Hurts not missed any time this year, I think it could have gone to Hurts, but because of those missed games, I think Mahomes would, ended up taking home the award. I think that's what it came down to. And, it's the great debate of like what the MVP award truly means, right? Because some people would argue that the MVP award means the best player in the entire league. But then there are also some people who think MVP, most valuable player, right? Most valuable player to a team in the league, right? That was a great debate years ago where I think it was back when Andrew Luck was still playing. Andrew Luck didn't win MVP because he wasn't the best player in the league, but everyone knew that if you took Andrew Luck off of the Colts would have they would have won 0 games without Andrew Luck. So the great debate of, what happens if you take a player away from the team and whatnot. But I think even still, Mahomes fits that argument very well. You take Mahomes out of the Chiefs. Do we think the Chiefs make the Super Bowl with Chad Henne? With the turnover that they had on their roster this year, right? You lose Tyreek Hill. I think Mahomes fits both of the arguments and is the deserved winner of the MVP award this year. Last award, again, the one that I had a bone to pick with. Comeback Player of the Year. Geno Smith. Okay. The other 2 nominees, Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. Okay. I know Geno Smith had been a backup for almost a decade, I want to say. It feels like it was almost a decade of backup quarterback, of being a backup quarterback, I should say. But he was still active. What exactly did Geno Smith come back from this year? From playing second fiddle to Russell Wilson? To me, that feels significantly what's the word? Significantly less, I'll just say it like that, than Christian McCaffrey, who came back from several injuries in injury-riddled seasons. Saquon Barkley, same thing. And Christian McCaffrey being traded from Carolina to San Francisco, I think that helps a little bit in terms of just how well McCaffrey did just going from Carolina to San Francisco. Saquon pretty much carried that offense. I know Daniel Jones had a big part in it, but Saquon was the offense for the Giants. Again, McCaffrey and Saquon were battling injuries either within the last couple of years. There was adversity. And I'm not trying to say that Geno didn't have any adversity, because it is a very tough job to go from a backup to a starter and continue the success that Seattle has seen, right? It's very difficult to do that. And again, I'm not saying that Geno didn't face any adversity, but when you compare the adversity of Geno Smith to what Saquon and McCaffrey had to battle back from. That's why I don't think Geno Smith should have been comeback player of the year. Again, not to say that Geno Smith didn't have a great year, because he did. He had a fantastic year. But I think Saquon and McCaffrey came back from more than Geno Smith. At the end of the day, I'm just a bystander. I'm a fan. I'm just reacting. Geno Smith had a fantastic year, and I'm happy for him because it's been a long time. I don't want to say it's been a long time coming, but it has been a very up and down career for Geno up until this point. And winning this award really should be a symbol of just a never give up mentality, to never give up, to always persevere kind of, mentality. So congrats to all those guys. Most of them deserving. I'm sorry. I need to be more positive about Geno Smith winning that award. But anyway, that's really about it for news and notes. Again, the big game is on Sunday. I'll give you my prediction here real quick. I think the Eagles actually, I don't want to say wallop the Chiefs, but I think it will be a pretty dominant Eagles performance. Give me Eagles 38, Chiefs 21. That's the kind of game I'm expecting. So again, that was news and notes. And now we are going to get into the top 10 tight ends of the 2022-2023 fantasy football season. But before we do, let's take a quick break and hear about our friends over at Underdog Fantasy.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100.
All right. Top 10 tight ends of the fantasy football season. We'll start at the top, talk about that player, and work our way down. And to really no one's surprise, the tight end one on the year. Actually, I really should. Before we get into the list, I need to mention these players that didn't make the list, because when we get towards the bottom of this top 10 list, it'll sound weird, but it's really because these players I'm about to mention didn't play a full season. That's really why I think the guys that I'm going to mention didn't make the top 10. It's because they didn't play a full season. Dallas Goedert, I believe, was a tight end 12 on the year. David Njoku, I believe, was a tight end 11 this year. Gerald Everett was within the top 10 tight ends for a very good chunk of the season. Darren Waller battled injuries. Zach Ertz played about half the season before going on IR. Kyle Pitts played about half the season, but Kyle Pitts, even when he was playing, it wasn't very good. Those guys did not make the top 10 list. But again, I think if you give Goddard and Njoku, Zach Ertz, Darren Waller a full season, I think you find those guys in the top 10 over some of these guys. But anyway, let's get on to the top 10 list, starting with tight end 1 on the year, none other than Travis Kelce. Not a big shock at all. I think if you didn't think Travis Kelce was going to finish as the tight end 1 or at least the tight end 2, you were fooling yourself. And I will throw my hands up because I thought Mark Andrews would be the tight end 1 again this year. Turns out that wasn't the case. But I didn't have Kelce too far behind Mark Andrews. And I think a lot of people understood why you could have Mark Andrews as the tight end 1 in fantasy. He just didn't deliver on that this year. And Travis Kelce proved it again. And he proved it to a point where he may be early first round pick in fantasy drafts next year, because you get such a positional advantage. You are getting a wide receiver at the tight end spot, essentially. That's what you're getting, right? 110 receptions on 152 targets for a little over 1,300 yards, 12 touchdowns. You are getting a wide receiver at the tight end position. And Kelce finished with almost 6 fantasy points per game more than the tight end 2, who was TJ Hawkinson. That's insane. That kind of advantage should be prioritized. And let me clarify that real quick. Only Travis Kelce. Okay, it's only Travis. I don't think you can make I can't say I think. You definitely cannot make that argument for TJ Hawkinson, George Kittle, Mark Andrews now. Right? You can't make that argument. It is Travis Kelce and Travis Kelce only. So, Travis Kelce, this was now his 3rd season out of the last 5 that he's finished with at least 100 receptions and 1,300 yards. Ultra productive. He had 11 finishes in the top 5 in PPR formats this year. Again, that is Travis Kelce, a wide receiver at the tight end position. Onto the tight end 2, as I mentioned earlier, was TJ Hawkinson, who finished with 86 receptions on 129 targets, a little over 900 yards, 6 touchdowns, and he averaged about 12.7 fantasy points per game, I believe it is. TJ Hawkinson really is a story. You can't really even say it's a tale of 2 seasons, but when you break it down, it is a tale of 2 seasons for him. Started off the season with the Lions, and weeks 1 through 8, he was a tight end 4, which you're like, oh, so what's the problem then? Most of his points came from one game, and that was against Seattle, where he had 39.9 fantasy points. All those other games, he averaged 6.5 fantasy points. So that 39-point game is kind of inflating everything from his time with the Lions. He gets traded to Minnesota at the deadline from weeks 9 until the end of the season. Then TJ Hawkinson was the tight end 3. He had a 35-point game against the Giants in the first matchup, and in the whiteout game. But I think the big difference with Hawkinson is that going to the Vikings, it was almost a 4-point swing in all those other games, right? So if you take out that 35-point game from Hawkinson, he was averaging 10.4 fantasy points per game. That's a 4-point swing from what he was doing in Detroit. And that's what you love to see from Hawkinson. I have the man's jersey like right over there. He's one of my favorite players on the Vikings now. He is incredibly gifted in receiving. He did have a fair amount of drops. So the reception total could have been higher, but when you stand alone, pretty much, when Kelce's in his own tier, Hawkinson pretty much, stood out in his own tier right below Kelce this year in terms of the volume and production that he had. Hawkinson is going to be a very intriguing person in drafts next year because there may be a lot of people that are going to try to I shouldn't say reach, even though they will reach. I think people are going to try to jump the gun on TJ Hawkinson next year, just because the drop off from Kelce to all the other tight ends, again, was 6 points per game. So we could see people try to jump the gun a little bit for TJ Hawkinson in drafts next year. But if you can get TJ Hawkinson at like his ADP, find the value that he's at in whatever round that is, I think he's absolutely worth the pick that you would take him at. But we can't be reaching on him. I don't think he's reachable. Really, any of these tight ends, I wouldn't be reaching on tight ends really ever. And we'll go over that more as we get closer to the next fantasy football season. But TJ Hawkinson, incredibly productive in his time with the Vikings. Lucas likes to call him Uncle Hawk. He's so good. He is so good. That's coming from a biased Vikings fan. Tight end 3 on the year. Welcome back, George Kittle. Kittle didn't really have the most flashy of stats this year. It was only 60 catches on 86 targets. But what put him into the top 3 was having 11 touchdowns. And he played only 15 games this year. So he was almost averaging a touchdown a game. It was his career high in touchdowns, again, with 11. That was second in the league in terms out of all tight ends. I think what made people fall back in love with George Kittle, though, was that during fantasy playoffs, right, weeks 15 to week 18, Kittle was the tight end 1 and averaging 21.6 points per game. That it felt like the Kittle of old, right? Maybe not so much in the way that he earned his points, right? Because the Kittle in the past was a yak monster, right? But the touchdowns were there this year. Kittle will also be very interesting when drafts come around next year, because where do you put that, right? Touchdowns are not the most sticky of stats. And with tight ends, you do really need to focus on like the sticky stats, right? So where do you take him in drafts? Where do you rank him in terms of all these tight ends? Because again, you had guys like Dallas Goedert, Darren Waller, Zach Ertz, Kyle Pitts that all missed this year, or a good chunk of this year, right? They'll be back healthy. So where do you put Kittle in drafts? I'm very, very intrigued by that. But again, it was very, very good to see Kittle back again, because at the beginning of the year, they really used him as a blocker, and that was beyond frustrating. And that's why I will always admit that Kyle Shanahan is a great coach, but he is your enemy as a fantasy manager, because you have a weapon like George Kittle. You would think you put him out in space a whole lot more. Nah, they really use George Kittle as a left tackle. That's really what they used him as for a good chunk of the beginning of the season. And then they kind of let loose a little bit and let him put him back into the receiving work. And here we are, tight end 3 finish for George Kittle. Onto the tight end 4 now. Probably one of the bigger disappointments, which, is funny in terms of just, where Mark Andrews has finished in the past to where he finished this year, right? And where he was taken in drafts, and he was getting second round consideration. If I'm remembering correct, maybe it was third round consideration in drafts. So a tight end 4 finish really isn't the end of the world, but it was the way that it happened, right? The first 8 weeks of the season, he had 2 finishes outside of the top 40, but he had 4 finishes in the top 3, right? So it was a little inconsistent, but the top 3 finishes made those really bad games worth it. But then from week 9 until the end of the season, he was the tight end 16. And there's stats in there. I'm trying to remember what his fantasy points per game was from weeks 9 to the end of the season, but it wasn't great. And I think an argument could be made that that's just because Lamar got hurt towards the end of the season. But I think how Mark Andrews finished this year, right, again, from weeks 9 to the end of the season, it's going to leave such a sour taste in people's mouths. And I completely understand it. Because, again, if you're taking him in the second, third round of fantasy drafts, we're not really looking for tight end 16 for second half of the year. We're looking for top 10 consistency. Mark Andrews didn't really have that this year. And we're getting into territory now of tight ends that were, I should say, wildly inconsistent. Mark Andrews, first example of that. And it really wasn't so much of an up and down, week by week finish for Andrews. But you knew what he could do You knew, again, he had 4 top 3 finishes in the first 8 weeks of the season, so you knew he could do it. You know that he still can do it moving forward. But then tight end 16 just made it feel fairly inconsistent. Continuing on with the theme of inconsistent tight ends, your tight end 5 on the year was none other than Jacksonville Jaguars tight end Evan Ingram. This one is shocking to me. I don't think anyone was anticipating or predicting such a big year for Evan Ingram. And in hindsight, it should have clicked that, like, wait, Doug Peterson, who was in Philly, who was in Kansas City before that, was a part of helping develop Travis Kelce. I'm trying to remember if Travis Kelce's like dominance overlapped with Doug Peterson at all. But if it didn't, he at least helped develop him just being an offensive guy. Then goes to Philly, where he then gets to work with Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, who were 2 very good tight ends. Doug Peterson has an eye for tight ends. So I don't know why it didn't really click. Again, hindsight's 2020. But if Doug Peterson can single out a tight end that he wants, that means something. So we'll see if Evan Ingram re-signs with the Jags this offseason. But if he doesn't, I will be paying very close attention to whatever tight end the Jaguars decide to bring in, because whatever tight end they bring in is going to have, a role to play. I'll just put it that way. They will have a decent role to play within the Jacksonville offense, because that's Doug Peterson's system. Evan Ingram was the tight end 1 from weeks 13 to 16 this year, which was incredible. There was the Tennessee game. I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but it was absurd. I want to say it was like 40 points or something. It was unreal what he was doing during that stretch. But again, the theme of inconsistency. He was beyond inconsistent this year. He had 5 finishes lower than the tight end 35. He was either at tight end 35 or lower. 5 finishes. He had 8 total finishes below the tight end 20 on the year. Wildly inconsistent. I didn't really get to take a good look to see how that tight end 1 stretch, how much it inflated his total at the end of the year. But again, a lot of people did not expect this from Evan Ingram, leaving the Giants in what was a very up and down, and mainly down tenure with the Giants. I think this finish from Evan Ingram surprises a lot of people. 73 receptions on 98 targets for 766 yards, 4 touchdowns. And I forgot to mention Mark Andrews' stat line. He has 73 catches, same as Ingram. Andrews still had 113 targets. So the targets are still there for Andrews, which gives me some hope and optimism for next year in that 5 touchdowns on almost 850 yards for Andrews. Anyways, back to Evan Ingram. 98 targets, 766 yards for 4 touchdowns. Don't think anyone saw that stat line happening, that kind of volume, that kind of production happening. So kudos to Evan Ingram. If he does resign in Jacksonville, again, it gets very interesting. And I've said that a lot about these tight ends, whether that's in draft positions and all that kind of stuff. But Evan Ingram truly would be very interesting, just because the player. And I should say, you're looking at the player, and you look at the Jacksonville Jaguars with Calvin Ridley supposedly coming back, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, Travis Etienne year 2. I should say year 3, but year 2, because this was his first year playing. Like, it'll be very, very fascinating to see where he goes. I don't think he finishes as high as 10 and 5. Again, if some of the guys I mentioned earlier play a full season, top 5 for Evan Ingram is pretty darn impressive, if you ask me. Tight end 6 also fits into this kind of inconsistent tier, I'll call it. Rams tight end Tyler Higbee. This one I just kind of laugh at because you can ask Cameron about this. Higbee was one of my dark horse tight ends to finish top 10 on the year. But I didn't stand on it enough. I didn't make it known enough, lesson learned, because I would have been right. But Higbee had always kind of flown under the radar, in my opinion, in years past. In terms, when you look at the production that he had and all that kind of stuff, he kind of flew under the radar a bit just because Cooper Kupp was a thing. I mean, that was last year, and then you had Jared Goff with the Rams and stuff. Like, Higbee had always flown under the radar, in my opinion. And he made it. He came through this year, Odell didn't come back. They moved on from Robert Woods. So in terms of pass catchers, it truly was Cooper Kupp and Tyler Higbee. And Stafford helped out with that a lot until he got hurt. And then it was then very bumpy for Higbee rest of the year. But for Tyler Higbee to have 72 catches on 108 targets for 620 yards, 3 touchdowns, I think that's a lot better than people expected. Maybe, the 3 touchdowns are going to make you go, that's not super great. But 72 receptions for 108 targets, or I should say on 108 targets. For Tyler Higbee, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive in my book. So, I don't know how it works next year, though, with Higbee. Do the Rams? Oh, I forgot to mention Allen Robinson. Holy cow. How did I forget to mention Allen Robinson about that plays a part into Higbee's production too, because Allen Robinson didn't really do a whole lot. So Stafford had to have another option besides Cooper Kupp, and that ended up being Tyler Higbee. So I don't know how that works next year with the Rams, right? You're going to have Cooper Kupp back. Matt Stafford is going to be back, supposedly healthy. Allen Robinson will be healthy again. So another year in the system for all those guys. Do they gel a little bit better? What does that mean for Higbee? We'll see. We will see. Tight end 7 on the year was a little more steady Eddie in when you compare this guy to Higbee and Evan Ingram. But Pat Freiermuth, tight end 7 on the year. Freiermuth actually had a very good season. It just was not as flashy as a Tyler Higbee and then an Evan Ingram, who finished tight end 1 in some weeks. So Freiermuth never really flashed, right, in terms of weekly finishes. He was relatively steady. He had 8 top 10 finishes on the year. 63 receptions on 98 targets for 732 yards, but only 2 touchdowns. So that definitely hurts a bit, is the 2 touchdowns. People are also going to remember him, though, by how he finished this year. Week 17, he was the tight end 29. Week 18, he was the tight end 57 after throwing up a goose egg on just 2 targets in week 18. I feel like people are going to have that kind of memory of Freiermuth, but they're going to forget all the other finishes that he had. And again, he had 8 top 10 finishes. So if he's really outside of the top 10 anywhere else, I'm going to say that's great value for a tight end to target in a draft. Relatively steady. Another year with Kenny Pickett. Obviously, Deontay Johnson's still there. George Pickens could take another step. Pittsburgh is going to look to upgrade the offensive line to hopefully get the run game going, which helps out everything else, especially in Pittsburgh. But again, if we find Freiermuth outside of the top 10, he's going to be, I can guarantee you, he would be my favorite tight end target then, because then I can build up the rest of my roster with other skill players and then grab Freiermuth late, who has potential, to play into top 10 territory. Pat Freiermuth at the tight end 7. Let's quickly recap the list so far. Travis Kelce was the tight end 1. TJ Hawkinson was the tight end 2. George Kittle, tight end 3. Mark Andrews, tight end 4. Evan Ingram, tight end 5. Tyler Higbee, tight end 6. Pat Freiermuth, tight end 7. And the tight end 8 of the year was Cole Kmet. And we were pretty in on Cole Kmet right around draft time. There were stats from his 2021 campaign that really that was very intriguing, I should say, to the fellas. And Cole Kmet was our favorite late round tight end target. And at the beginning of the year, he made us look like a fool. He was the tight end 31 from weeks 1 to 8. But from week 9 until until the end of the season, he was the tight end 4. So there was a bit of a turnaround in terms of production and really opportunity for Cole Kmet. Like, if you were to split his season in half, he got a whole lot more usage in the second half of the season. And that may be because Darnell Mooney got hurt and, there were some other factors that played into it. But again, another year, Justin Fields, another year in that system, development, can you bank on Justin Fields' development as a passer? I think you can, maybe just a little bit. I feel like it's natural for a quarterback to just develop, especially for a young quarterback like Justin Fields, who had one coach his rookie year, gets a new coach his sophomore year. That kind of change can stunt a bit of development. But now he's going into year 2 with the same scheme, same play caller, coordinator, coach, all that kind of stuff. So if Fields takes a step, I feel like Cole Kmet then can take a step forward, just because there will be more opportunity for Cole Kmet. But it can't. I feel like people are going to try to push Cole Kmet into the top 10, banking on the development of Justin Fields. And so they'll push Kmet into the top 10, and I wouldn't necessarily put him there, and maybe the best way to describe it is this, right? How I was saying Freiermuth could be outside of the top 10. If I'm picking need a tight end and Cole Kmet and Freiermuth are are my 2 choices, I'm still taking Freiermuth really like 8 times out of 10, maybe even 9 times out of 10. But you can't deny that there is a real possibility that Cole Kmet could take a step forward in terms of fantasy production if Justin Fields himself takes a step forward in terms of being a passer. Kmet finished with 50 catches on the year on 69 targets, a little shy of 550 yards, and he had 7 touchdowns. So the touchdowns helped him out a lot. And I think, excuse me, I think you can say this about Kmet in the tight end 9. This is the tier where, had Dallas Goedert and all those guys that I mentioned at the beginning of this list, if they played a full season, they definitely are finishing ahead of a guy like Cole Kmet. Not a knock on the guy, but just putting it in perspective, 7 touchdowns on 50 catches. There's just not a whole lot of volume that I can buy into. And again, the volume got there towards the end of the season, but 8.7 fantasy points per game across the entire season. That was his average. That's, I think, what we have to look at Cole Kmet as. If you believe in the development of Justin Fields, all power to you. You can go ahead and take Cole Kmet as early as you want. Then I'm not banking on that. I'm not banking on a huge step forward from Justin Fields. Tight end 9 on the year is none other than Taysom Hill. Here we go. Taysom Hill, top 10 tight end in fantasy football in 2022. Obviously, you're going to look at Taysom Hill's stat line. You're like, wait a second. He only had 9 catches. All of his value came from running. He had 96 carries, 575 yards, and 7 rushing touchdowns. His receiving stats, 9 catches, 13 targets, 77 yards for 2 touchdowns. Taysom Hill's value is from rushing and running the ball. He offers you 0 receiving upside. 0. Can you bank on that next year? I don't know. Taysom Hill, in my opinion, would be a great kind of tight end 2 to have, but I don't think it's necessarily smart to have 2 tight ends on your roster because you can probably find someone on the waivers who can fill in for, your starter when they're on a bye, right? But I feel like Taysom Hill would be one of the best tight end 2s to have on your team. Because what if your starter is on bye and that's the same week that Taysom Hill decides to run for 2 touchdowns, right? I think that's the range that we need to look at Taysom Hill at. And I think that's really, I don't think ceiling is the right word. I think the way to say it is this. The right range for Taysom Hill is going to be that kind of tight end 15 at the highest, tight end 20, 25 at the lowest, because he's going to be your backup. There's no way that you can start Taysom Hill as your tight end next year. Everyone's going to be infatuated with the 7 rushing touchdowns. And the guy had 10 top 12 finishes, right? Like, you can't deny that. But again, what he offers from the tight end position is very, very different than all the other tight ends and literally every tight end besides Travis Kelce, because Travis Kelce is a wide receiver. But Taysom Hill, yes, he has, his boom weeks are outrageous. But he doesn't have enough of them, in my opinion, to warrant a starting tight end spot in fantasy next year. Great guy to pick up maybe on, when your guy has a bye week, but you can't have him as a mainstay in your lineup as at the tight end spot. I found this stat though when looking through his year. I found this one very, very fascinating. In games that he got 7 or more carries, he had 6 games with 7 or more carries. So in those 6 games when he had 7 or more carries, the Saints were 6-0. 6-0. They won every single game that Taysom Hill had 7 or more carries in. Is there a possibility that they just give him more carries now? I think there's a slim chance. If you keep winning, because again, it keeps the defense on their toes. Is it going to be Kamara? Is it going to be Taysom Hill? Are we going to throw the ball? Is it going to be to Rashid Shaheed? Is that how? I think that's who it is. You going to throw it to him down the field? Chris Olave coming over the middle? Is Michael Thomas going to be healthy? Right? It keeps the defense on their toes by giving Taysom Hill 7 or more carries. That's what it did this year, at least. But again, I'm just trying to have a good time. He's going to be your backup tight end if you take him in a draft. Can't be a starter. Probably belongs on waivers. Is going to be kind of the player that I think a lot of people should pick up during the year just based on when their starting tight end has a bye week. Tight end 10 on the year. The last tight end to wrap up this list. Dalton Schultz. Dalton Schultz was a very trendy pick because he was the next tight end off the board after kind of the big 5 of drafts last year, with Kelsey and Andrews and Kittle and Waller. Schultz is kind of right there at that 5-6 spot. And there were a lot of people saying, well, don't waste a high draft pick on some of those other guys when you can get Dalton Schultz, who is just as good. I shouldn't say just as good, but wasn't too far behind in terms of just fantasy points per game, right? But I think we can all agree that this wasn't as productive. This wasn't as productive of a year for Dalton Schultz as we expected, and certainly as in years past. 57 catches on 89 targets for 507 yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, and those 5 receiving touchdowns all came in the second half of the year. So, it was a very slow start for Dalton Schultz beginning of the year. He was the tight end 27 before their bye week. I believe in week 8, maybe it was week 9, one of those 2 weeks. It took him a while to get going. After the bye, though, he was the tight end 4. And that was partially because he started to get more volume, but he also found the end zone. I think a lot of people are going to come out of the woodwork this offseason and say that Dalton Schultz has always been a tight end, or has always been a touchdown dependent tight end. And I can't say that I don't disagree with that argument, but I think it lacks a lot of context. In games that he scored this year, which was 3 games, I believe, because he had 2 games with 2 touchdowns, he had relatively solid volume to complement all the touchdowns, right? The only game that you really could question was his game against the Giants in week 12. He had 4 catches on 4 targets. 2 of those went for touchdowns, right? That's the only game that you can really have a legitimate argument of being a touchdown dependent tight end, right? But all of his other games where he scored, week 10 against Green Bay, 6 catches on 8 targets, 54 yards. If he doesn't have the touchdown, that's 11.4 fantasy points, and that's pretty solid for a tight end. The other game that he scored in where he had 2 touchdowns was against Tennessee. He had 7 catches on 10 targets for 56 yards. Again, you take away the touchdowns, that's 12.6 fantasy points. That's pretty solid volume. I shouldn't say volume. That's pretty solid production for a tight end. And he had other stat lines like that sporadically placed throughout the year. Week 1, Tampa Bay, 7 receptions, 9 targets, 62 yards, 13.2 fantasy points. Week 8 against Chicago, 6 receptions, 7 targets, 74 yards. That's 13.4 fantasy points. Week 14 against Houston, he had 6 catches on 10 targets for 87 yards. That's 14.7 fantasy points, right? So he had games where he got volume that you saw when he scored. But just in those games, he didn't score. But the volume that he got is still solid enough. So again, like I said, I don't disagree necessarily with the argument that Dalton Schultz is a bit touchdown dependent. But if you don't mention the volume that he does get with the touchdowns and even without the touchdowns, I think it's a flawed argument. And I'm still going to put Dalton Schultz in my top 7 tight ends for sure next year. But I think a lot of people kind of forced Dalton Schultz into that top 5 and that upper echelon of fantasy tight ends, right? Your Travis Kelce's, Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Darren Waller's of the world. A lot of people kind of pushed him into that echelon, and I think a lot of people learned their lesson this year. But again, it was still a relatively solid year, and he missed 2 games this year, right? So his fantasy points per game were not. He averaged 9.5 fantasy points per game. I think it's going to be a little bit better than that next year. But again, we learned our lesson. We can't necessarily put Dalton Schultz into that upper echelon of tight ends. Let's recap top 10 tight ends real quick. Travis Kelce, tight end 1. TJ Hawkinson, tight end 2. George Kittle came in at tight end 3, tight end 4. Mark Andrews, tight end 5. Evan Ingram, tight end 6. Tyler Higbee, tight end 7. Pat Freiermuth, 8 was Cole Kmet. Taysom Hill came in at tight end 9. And Dalton Schultz at tight end 10. That finishes up the list, and that finishes up another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening, viewing, subscribing, all those things. And again, I know I just said subscribe at the beginning. I just said it now. You should hit the subscribe button, though, if you're watching us on YouTube. Or just follow us wherever you're listening to us, whether that's on Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, whatever Apple has. Follow us there. Give this video a like if you're watching on YouTube. But again, thanks for tuning in to another episode. We'll be back next week. Maybe kicking off some dynasty content. I know that after the Super Bowl ends, it really turns to free agency in the draft, which is where I come in. I've been scouting my running backs over the past couple weeks. I'm very, very close to having that list complete. I'm pretty sure I've got my top 5 solidified. So be paying attention in the near future for more incoming rookie videos and dynasty content and all that good stuff. So again, my name is Tyler Plath. You can find me on Twitter at Tyler_Plath. I almost forgot my Twitter handle. That would have been embarrassing. You can find the Fantasy Football Fellas at FFLs on Twitter, the FFLs. Oh my word. Can I restart that? FFLs, Twitter, the FF Fellas, Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas, anywhere you get your podcasts, YouTube, and the good old TikTok. Until next week, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time. Deuces.